Sarah Mitchell had always been afraid of flying. At 34, she had managed to avoid air travel for most of her adult life, choosing long drives or train rides whenever possible. But when her sister called with news that their father had suffered a heart attack in Denver, Sarah knew she had no choice. The 12-hour drive from Seattle wasn't an option when every minute could matter. As she settled into seat 14C aboard the small regional aircraft, Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she fastened her seatbelt. The plane could hold only 28 passengers, and today it was nearly full. She had specifically chosen a window seat, thinking the view might distract her from her anxiety. What she didn't know was that this decision would soon put her in the perfect position to notice something that would save everyone on board. The flight attendant, a cheerful woman named Jessica, made her way down the narrow aisle, checking seatbelts and offering reassuring smiles. Sarah noticed that Jessica seemed particularly attentive to an elderly gentleman in the front row who appeared nervous. The kindness in Jessica's voice as she explained the safety features helped calm Sarah's own nerves. Captain Robert Hayes, a veteran pilot with 22 years of experience, completed his pre-flight checks in the cockpit. Beside him sat First Officer Maria Santos, who had recently joined the airline after completing her training. They had flown together several times before, and Hayes appreciated Santos's attention to detail and calm demeanor. The weather report showed clear skies for the 2-hour flight to Denver, and both pilots felt confident about the journey ahead. As the engines powered up, Sarah pressed her face to the small window and watched the ground crew making their final preparations. She had read somewhere that takeoff and landing were the most dangerous parts of any flight, so she tried to focus on her breathing exercises. The plane began to taxi toward the runway, and Sarah could feel her heart rate increasing. The takeoff went smoothly, and within minutes they were climbing through the clouds. Sarah was surprised to find that once they reached cruising altitude, her anxiety began to fade. The view from 30,000 feet was actually quite beautiful, with puffy white clouds scattered below them like cotton balls on a blue canvas. She even managed to accept a cup of coffee from Jessica when the beverage service began. About 40 minutes into the flight, Sarah noticed something odd. She had been idly watching the wing outside her window when she saw what appeared to be a small stream of fluid trailing behind the engine. At first, she thought it might be normal. Perhaps just condensation or some kind of exhaust. But as she watched more closely, the stream seemed to be getting larger and more visible. Sarah hesitated to say anything. She didn't want to be the paranoid passenger who caused a panic over nothing. But something about the way the fluid was flowing didn't look right to her. It reminded her of the time her car had developed a coolant leak, leaving a steady drip in her driveway. This looked similar, except they were thousands of feet in the air. She pressed the call button above her seat, and Jessica appeared within moments, her professional smile in place. Sarah pointed toward the window and quietly explained what she was seeing. Jessica leaned over to look, and Sarah noticed the flight attendant's expression change subtly. The smile remained, but there was now a hint of concern in her eyes. Jessica thanked Sarah calmly and said she would check with the pilots right away. Sarah watched as the flight attendant made her way to the front of the cabin and picked up the phone to speak with the cockpit. Even from her seat several rows back, Sarah could see that Jessica was speaking in hushed, urgent tones. In the cockpit, Captain Hayes received Jessica's report with growing concern. He had been monitoring all the engine parameters, and everything appeared normal on his instruments. But he trusted his flight attendant's judgment, and more importantly, he knew that sometimes passengers could see things from angles that weren't visible to the pilots. First Officer Santos immediately began running through their emergency checklists, while Hayes contacted air traffic control to report a potential issue. They requested vectors to the nearest suitable airport, which turned out to be a small regional field about 30 miles to the southeast. Hayes also asked for emergency vehicles to be standing by, just as a precaution. As the pilots worked through their procedures, the situation in the passenger cabin remained calm. Most travelers were unaware that anything was wrong. Some were reading, others were napping, and a few were looking out their own windows at the scenery below. Jessica moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, quietly securing loose items and making mental notes of passengers who might need extra assistance in case of an emergency landing. Sarah continued to watch the wing, and her concern grew as the stream of fluid became more pronounced. She could now see that it was definitely coming from somewhere near the engine, and it was leaving a visible trail in the air behind them. She wondered if she should have spoken up sooner, or if there was anything else she should be doing. The elderly gentleman in the front row, whose name was Frank Morrison, had noticed the increased activity from the flight crew. As a retired mechanic who had worked on aircraft engines for 30 years, Frank had developed a keen sense for when something wasn't quite right. He watched Jessica's movements carefully and noticed the subtle changes in her demeanor that indicated she was following emergency protocols. Meanwhile, Hayes and Santos were dealing with a growing crisis in the cockpit. Their instruments were now showing a slow but steady loss of hydraulic fluid from the left engine. This was serious but manageable if they could reach an airport quickly. However, what worried Hayes more was that they seemed to be losing fluid faster than their gauges indicated was possible for a simple line rupture. Santos was in radio contact with their company's maintenance team, describing the symptoms and getting advice on emergency procedures. The maintenance supervisor recommended that they begin preparing for a single-engine approach, even though the left engine was still running normally. The precaution was necessary because hydraulic fluid loss could eventually lead to engine failure. As they began their descent toward the emergency airport, Hayes made the decision to inform the passengers about the situation. He knew that transparency was important, but he also wanted to avoid causing unnecessary panic. His announcement was calm and professional, explaining that they were making a precautionary landing due to a minor mechanical issue and that emergency vehicles would be standing by as a standard safety measure. Sarah felt a mix of vindication and terror as she heard the captain's words. She had been right to speak up, but now she was facing the very scenario that had made her afraid of flying in the first place. She gripped the armrests of her seat and tried to remember everything she had read about airline safety statistics. Frank Morrison unbuckled his seatbelt and made his way to where Jessica was preparing the cabin for landing. He quietly identified himself as a retired aircraft mechanic and offered to help in any way possible. Jessica was grateful for his expertise and asked him to help keep other passengers calm while she continued with her preparations. The descent toward the emergency airport was smooth, and many passengers remained unaware of the severity of the situation. Hayes was an experienced pilot who had handled emergency landings before, and his confidence helped keep everyone calm. Santos continued monitoring their instruments and maintaining radio contact with the control tower at their destination airport. As they approached the airport, Sarah could see the emergency vehicles lined up along the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, and other rescue equipment were positioned and ready. The sight was both frightening and reassuring. It was frightening because it confirmed that this was a serious situation, but reassuring because it showed that professional help was standing by. The landing itself was textbook perfect. Hayes brought the plane down gently, and as soon as they touched the runway, Sarah could see the emergency vehicles beginning to move alongside them. The pilots brought the aircraft to a safe stop, and within minutes, firefighters were examining the left engine, while paramedics stood ready to assist any passengers who might need medical attention. Jessica efficiently coordinated the passenger evacuation, though it turned out to be unnecessary. The engine problem, while serious, had not created any immediate danger to those on board. However, as the maintenance team examined the aircraft more closely, they discovered that the situation had been more critical than anyone had initially realized. The hydraulic line failure was extensive, and if the flight had continued for another 30 minutes, they likely would have experienced complete engine failure. Sarah's quick observation and willingness to speak up had potentially saved the lives of everyone on board. What she didn't yet know was that this was only the beginning of a much more complicated situation that would test everyone's skills and courage in ways they never expected. The emergency landing had been successful, but as the passengers waited in the small terminal building of Riverside Regional Airport, they learned that their problems were far from over. The maintenance team's inspection revealed that the hydraulic failure was more severe than initially thought, and the aircraft would need extensive repairs before it could fly again. Airport manager Tom Bradley found himself dealing with an unexpected crisis. Riverside Regional was a small facility that handled mainly private planes and occasional cargo flights. They weren't equipped to handle 28 stranded passengers, especially not overnight. The nearest commercial airport was over 2 hours away by car, and with evening approaching, transportation options were becoming limited. Sarah used her phone to call her sister with an update about the delay. The conversation was difficult because her father's condition had worsened, and every hour of delay felt crucial. As she spoke quietly in a corner of the small terminal, she noticed that several other passengers were having similar conversations with their families. Everyone seemed anxious about the indefinite delay. Captain Hayes emerged from his lengthy discussions with maintenance personnel and airline officials with troubling news. Not only was their aircraft grounded indefinitely, but a severe weather system was moving into the region. The storm was expected to bring high winds and heavy rain that would make it impossible for a replacement aircraft to land at the small airport for at least 12 hours. Frank Morrison, the retired mechanic, had been observing the maintenance team's work on the damaged engine. His experience told him that this wasn't a simple repair job. The hydraulic system had suffered cascade failures that would require specialized parts and expertise. He approached Captain Hayes and quietly shared his assessment that they would likely be stranded for much longer than the airline was admitting. As if the situation wasn't complicated enough, the small airport's weather monitoring equipment began showing signs that the approaching storm was intensifying faster than predicted. Wind speeds were already picking up, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. Tom Bradley realized that his tiny terminal building might soon be housing nearly 30 people overnight, possibly longer. Jessica, the flight attendant, took charge of organizing the passengers and making sure everyone had access to food and water. The airport's small cafe had closed hours earlier, but the owner, a local woman named Betty Chen, heard about the situation on her radio and drove back to help. Betty opened her cafe and began preparing sandwiches and coffee for the stranded travelers. The real crisis began around 8 in the evening when the weather suddenly took a dramatic turn for the worse. What had been predicted as a moderate storm system had intensified into something much more dangerous. The National Weather Service issued tornado warnings for the entire region, and local emergency management officials began evacuating low-lying areas. Tom Bradley received a call from County Emergency Services, informing him that Riverside Regional Airport was now serving as an emergency shelter for people evacuated from a nearby mobile home park. Within an hour, the small terminal building was housing not just the 28 airline passengers, but also 43 additional evacuees, including several families with young children and elderly residents. The situation became even more challenging when the power went out. The airport's backup generator could handle essential systems like runway lights and communication equipment, but it couldn't power the entire terminal building. Betty Chen found flashlights and battery-powered lanterns in the airport's emergency supplies, creating small circles of light throughout the darkened terminal. Sarah found herself helping to organize sleeping arrangements for the families with children. Her anxiety about flying seemed trivial now, compared to the immediate needs of scared children and worried parents. She worked with Jessica and several other passengers to create makeshift beds, using airport furniture cushions and blankets from the emergency supplies. Outside, the storm was reaching dangerous intensity levels. Wind gusts were approaching 60 miles per hour, and the rain was falling so hard that visibility was reduced to just a few feet. Tree branches and debris were being blown across the airport grounds, making it dangerous for anyone to venture outside. The small terminal building shook with each strong gust of wind. Captain Hayes found himself in an unusual position. While he was still technically responsible for his airline passengers, he also recognized that his leadership experience and calm demeanor were needed to help manage the larger group of evacuees. He worked with Tom Bradley to establish a communication system and organize resources for everyone sheltering in the building. Around midnight, the situation took another serious turn when an elderly evacuee named Martha Webb began experiencing chest pains. Frank Morrison, who had basic first aid training from his military service, helped assess her condition, while Jessica used her flight attendant medical training to monitor Martha's vital signs. Both agreed that Martha needed immediate medical attention. The problem was that emergency medical services couldn't reach the airport due to the severe weather conditions. Roads were flooded, debris blocked major routes, and rescue vehicles couldn't safely navigate in the high winds. The closest hospital was 20 miles away, and there was no way to transport Martha there until the storm passed. Sarah remembered that during the pre-flight safety demonstration, Jessica had mentioned that the aircraft was equipped with enhanced medical supplies, including an automated external defibrillator and oxygen equipment. She suggested that they might be able to access these supplies from the plane, even though the aircraft was grounded. Getting to the airplane meant venturing out into the dangerous weather. But Captain Hayes determined that Martha's condition was serious enough to justify the risk. He volunteered to go himself, along with Tom Bradley, who knew the airport layout and could help navigate in the darkness and wind. The journey to the aircraft was treacherous. Hayes and Bradley had to fight against wind gusts that threatened to knock them down, while dodging flying debris and navigating around puddles that had become small ponds. The 100-yard walk to the plane took nearly 15 minutes, and both men were soaked and exhausted by the time they reached the aircraft. Inside the plane, Hayes quickly gathered the medical supplies while Bradley held a flashlight. The aircraft's emergency power system was still functioning, which allowed them to access the overhead compartments where the medical equipment was stored. They collected the AED, oxygen bottles, and advanced first aid supplies before making the dangerous journey back to the terminal. Meanwhile, Sarah had taken on an unexpected leadership role among the evacuees. Her natural organizational skills and calm demeanor under pressure made her a focal point for coordinating various needs and activities. She worked with Betty Chen to manage food distribution, helped families settle their children for the night, and served as a liaison between the airline passengers and the local evacuees. When Hayes and Bradley returned with the medical supplies, Sarah assisted Jessica in setting up a makeshift medical station for Martha. While they couldn't provide the level of care available at a hospital, they were able to monitor Martha's condition and provide oxygen therapy that helped stabilize her breathing and heart rate. The storm continued to rage outside, with tornado warnings being extended through the early morning hours. The small terminal building had become a tight-knit community of people from very different backgrounds, all working together to weather the crisis. Children who had been crying earlier were now sleeping peacefully, comforted by the presence of so many caring adults. As the night progressed, Sarah found herself becoming the unofficial coordinator for the entire group. People naturally turned to her when they had questions or needed help with problems. She organized watch schedules so that adults could take turns monitoring the children and elderly evacuees while others rested. She also worked with Tom Bradley to ration food and water supplies to ensure they would last through the extended stay. Frank Morrison used his mechanical expertise to help Tom Bradley address several building maintenance issues that arose during the storm. A minor roof leak in one corner of the terminal required quick attention to prevent water damage to electrical equipment. Frank also helped secure several loose panels on the building's exterior that were rattling dangerously in the wind. By 3 a.m, the storm showed no signs of weakening, and weather forecasters were predicting that it would continue through the following day. The reality began to set in that everyone might be stranded for much longer than originally expected. Sarah found herself planning for extended shelter operations, including sanitation needs, food rationing, and maintaining morale among increasingly stressed evacuees. Captain Hayes maintained radio contact with both his airline and local emergency management officials, providing regular updates on the condition and needs of everyone sheltering at the airport. His professional communication skills and aviation experience with emergency procedures proved invaluable in ensuring that outside agencies understood their situation and were preparing appropriate assistance. The most challenging moment came around 4 a.m. when 6-year-old Emma Rodriguez became seriously ill with what appeared to be an allergic reaction to something she had eaten. Her mother, Maria Rodriguez, was panicking as Emma's breathing became labored and her face began to swell. Once again, the group's limited medical resources would be put to the test, and Sarah would find herself stepping up to help coordinate another life-threatening emergency. Emma Rodriguez's allergic reaction escalated quickly, and her mother Maria was becoming increasingly frantic as her daughter struggled to breathe. The swelling around Emma's eyes and throat was visibly worsening, and everyone in the terminal could hear the child's labored breathing echoing through the quiet building. Sarah immediately moved to help, drawing on parenting instincts she didn't know she possessed. She had no children of her own, but something about Emma's distress triggered a protective response that overrode her own fears and uncertainty. She knelt beside the frightened little girl, while Jessica began searching through their medical supplies for anything that might help with an allergic reaction. Frank Morrison remembered that his wife had carried an emergency epinephrine injector for severe bee sting allergies. He began asking everyone in the terminal if anyone had similar medication. The response came from an unexpected source, elderly Martha Webb, who, despite her own recent medical episode, revealed that she always traveled with an EpiPen due to her severe peanut allergy. The problem was that Martha's medication was in her purse, which was buried somewhere under the pile of belongings that evacuees had hastily gathered when leaving their homes. In the darkness and confusion of the storm shelter, finding one small purse among dozens of bags and suitcases seemed almost impossible. Sarah took charge of organizing a systematic search. She divided the available adults into teams and assigned each group a specific area of the terminal to search. Using the limited flashlights and phone lights available, they began methodically going through every bag and personal item in the building. Time was critical, as Emma's breathing was becoming more difficult by the minute. Captain Hayes maintained radio contact with emergency medical services, describing Emma's symptoms and getting guidance on treatment options. The dispatcher confirmed that an epinephrine injection was exactly what Emma needed, but also warned that even if they found the medication, Emma would still need immediate professional medical care after receiving the injection. The search took nearly 20 minutes, during which Emma's condition continued to deteriorate. Her lips were turning blue, and she was making frightening wheezing sounds with each breath. Maria Rodriguez was crying and praying in Spanish while holding her daughter, and several other parents in the shelter were visibly shaken by watching another child in distress. Finally, Betty Chen found Martha's purse tucked under a blanket near the makeshift medical area. Martha quickly retrieved her EpiPen and handed it to Jessica, who had the most medical training among the group. However, Jessica had never actually administered an epinephrine injection, and her hands were shaking as she prepared to give Emma the life-saving medication. Sarah stepped in and gently took the EpiPen from Jessica's trembling hands. She had no medical training, but her voice was steady and calm as she spoke to both Emma and Maria in soothing tones. She had watched her neighbor use a similar device on her own child years earlier, and she remembered the basic procedure. More importantly, she projected the confidence that everyone in that moment desperately needed. With Maria holding Emma steady, Sarah carefully removed the safety cap from the EpiPen and positioned it against the child's thigh. She spoke calmly to Emma, telling her that this would help her breathe better, before pressing the device firmly against her leg and holding it in place for the required 10 seconds. The injection was successful, and within minutes, Emma's breathing began to improve dramatically. The immediate crisis was over, but everyone understood that Emma needed proper medical attention as soon as possible. The epinephrine injection had bought them time, but it was not a permanent solution. Captain Hayes worked with emergency services to arrange for Emma to be transported to the hospital as soon as weather conditions permitted any kind of rescue operation. As dawn approached, the storm finally began to weaken. The wind speeds dropped to more manageable levels, and the torrential rain decreased to a steady downpour. Tom Bradley received word that emergency crews were beginning to clear the main roads and hoped to reach the airport within a few hours. The first rescue vehicle to arrive was an ambulance, with a paramedic crew specially equipped to handle severe weather emergencies. They immediately took charge of Emma's care and prepared her for transport to the regional hospital. Maria Rodriguez tearfully thanked everyone who had helped save her daughter's life, with special gratitude for Sarah, whose quick thinking and calm leadership had made the difference. As the morning progressed, additional emergency vehicles arrived to assist with the evacuation of all the storm refugees. The mobile home park residents were transported to a proper Red Cross shelter in town, while arrangements were made to bus the airline passengers to the nearest commercial airport for rebooking on other flights. However, Sarah made an unexpected decision. When the bus arrived to take the airline passengers to their connecting flights, she chose not to board. Instead, she volunteered to stay behind and help Tom Bradley and Betty Chen clean up the terminal and assist with any remaining evacuees who needed help. Her decision surprised everyone, especially considering that she had been so anxious to reach Denver to see her father. When Captain Hayes asked her about her choice, Sarah explained that the night had changed her perspective on what was truly important. She had discovered capabilities within herself that she never knew existed, and she wanted to make sure everyone else was safely taken care of before continuing her own journey. Frank Morrison also chose to stay, using his mechanical skills to help assess storm damage to the airport facilities and assist with temporary repairs. Together, Sarah and Frank worked with the airport staff to restore normal operations and help coordinate relief efforts for other storm victims in the community. The story of what happened at Riverside Regional Airport that night quickly spread through local news media and eventually gained national attention. Sarah Mitchell, who had started as a nervous passenger afraid of flying, had become an unlikely hero whose observational skills had prevented a potential aviation disaster, and whose leadership during the storm had helped save lives and maintain calm among dozens of stranded people. When reporters asked Sarah about her actions, she consistently deflected credit to others, emphasizing the teamwork and cooperation that had made everything possible. She spoke about Jessica's professional medical knowledge, Captain Hayes' experienced leadership, Frank Morrison's technical expertise, Betty Chen's generosity, and Tom Bradley's dedication to helping everyone stay safe. 3 days later, Sarah finally made it to Denver on a commercial flight. She discovered that her father's condition had stabilized, and the extra time had actually allowed doctors to perform a successful surgery that improved his long-term prognosis. Her sister told her that their father was proud when he heard about Sarah's actions during the storm, and that he couldn't wait to hear the full story. The experience had fundamentally changed Sarah's relationship with flying. Her fear hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been replaced with a deeper understanding of aviation safety and confidence in her ability to handle unexpected situations. More importantly, she had discovered personal strengths and leadership abilities that she had never recognized before. 6 months later, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Tom Bradley at Riverside Regional Airport. The facility was looking for a new assistant manager, someone who could handle emergency situations and coordinate with diverse groups of people under pressure. He offered her the position, explaining that her actions during the storm had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership skills they needed. Sarah accepted the job and moved to the small town near the airport. She found purpose in helping ensure that the facility could better serve travelers and handle emergency situations. She also became involved in community emergency preparedness programs, using her experience to help train others in crisis management and cooperation. The aircraft that had initially brought her to Riverside Regional was eventually repaired and returned to service, but not before the airline implemented new protocols for passenger observation reporting based on Sarah's experience. Her quick recognition of the hydraulic leak had led to improvements in how airlines train both crews and passengers to identify potential mechanical issues. Emma Rodriguez, the little girl whose life Sarah had helped save during the allergic reaction crisis, sent her a handwritten thank you letter on her 7th birthday. The letter, decorated with crayon drawings of airplanes and hearts, became one of Sarah's most treasured possessions. Emma's family visited the airport every year on the anniversary of the storm, bringing homemade cookies and updates on Emma's continued good health. Captain Hayes and First Officer Santos also stayed in touch with Sarah, and they sometimes stopped by Riverside Regional when their flight routes brought them through the area. Hayes later said in interviews that Sarah's actions that night had reminded him why he loved aviation. Not just for the technology and skill involved, but for the way it brought out the best in people when they faced challenges together. The legacy of that extraordinary night extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The story became a case study in crisis management training programs, highlighting how ordinary people can rise to meet extraordinary challenges when they work together and support each other. Sarah Mitchell had indeed been just a passenger when she boarded that flight, but her journey had transformed her into something much more significant: a leader, a lifesaver, and an inspiration to everyone who heard her story.